Logan Mills recording.
Addison.
Tammy.
Georgia.
Grief is a natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. The more significant the loss, the more intense your grief will be. Is all grief the same? No, most grief is not the same. 15 to 50% of people experience mild grief, while another 15% experience a more severe type. The type of loss can determine the amount or how heavy grief impacts someone can depend on the person. Millions of people experience grief. Even though grief is mainly associated with death, various things can cause grief such as divorce, loss of a friendship, retirement, etc. So the first part of my visual aid lists 4 different types of grief. The first type of grief listed is normal grief. Normal grief consists of normal behaviors, reactions to loss, and symptoms. Anticipatory grief is the process of letting go before an actual death has occurred. Complicated grief is an individual has trouble progressing through the normal, generally accepted phases or stages of grieving. Disenfranchised grief is when people experience grief when a loss is experienced and cannot always be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly shared. Grief is common, but some people do not even know what it is that they are experiencing. Grief and depression are easily confused. Grief is defined as deep sorrow, especially that caused by someone's death. Depression is defined as feelings of severe despondency and dejection, also with feelings of guilt accompanied by lack of energy, appetite, and sleep. There are 5 stages of grief, which the 5 stages are talked about in the definition of complicated grief. The 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. You do not have to experience these 5 stages to go through grief or heal from grief. Some things can slow down the healing process, such as avoiding emotions, substance abuse, erratic behaviors, etc. Physical symptoms of grief include weight loss and gain, fatigues, aches and pains, etc. Even though grief is normally associated as only an emotion, people may not know that the physical symptoms they are experiencing is actual grief itself. Now, comparing grief and depression for the second part of my visual aid says that depression is consistent depressed mood, pain is chronic, hard to identify origin, little decrease in somatic symptoms. Grief is when your mood fluctuates, pain directly related to loss, and the decrease in somatic symptoms with time. Some can argue that grief is something that doesn't happen to everyone, and that you have a much deeper problem if you experience this. However, this would be wrong. Grief is a very normal and common thing. While it can be confusing, difficult, and have physical and emotional symptoms, grief is something most people experience, even though the causes and types can vary. If more people had the understanding and resources to cope with grief, more people would be able to heal and overcome it much faster. If it was a topic that people shared about and openly discussed, it would help the feeling of loneliness. For example, Jason B. Rosenthal is the man that inspired my TED Talk. He talked about his journey through loss and grief when he lost his wife of 26 years to cancer. Grief is something I have experienced. Have you? You might have not even known it, but what if you would have? Not all grief is the same, but it can happen to anyone.